Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Washington surrendered Fort Necessity. Now he continues into the French and Indian War with British General Lord Braddock. If you'd like to support the channel, please subscribe, join the Patreon page, purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop, and share the videos. I appreciate all the support. By June 1755, Braddock's army was on the move at a snail's pace, covering just 2 miles a day. Washington was suffering from a fever and a splitting headache. Despite the ailment, he endeavored to stay with the column of marching men. Braddock sent the young man to the rear to see a physician and to get some rest. However, the young Virginian didn't want to miss out on a battle with the French. Sitting on a pillow placed on his saddle to ease the jarring motion of the horse, he rode to the army just after a few days of rest, still not well. As the British contingent neared Fort Duquesne, the long line of soldiers, camp followers, artillery, and supply wagons was attacked by a combined French and Indian force from the fort. Panic began to set in as the colonial and British troops attempted to return fire amidst the chaos. Braddock and Washington rode to the front where the attack was taking place and attempted to restore order. 2 horses were shot out from under Washington. One pinned him down, but the young man scrambled out from under it. After 3 hours of fighting, Braddock was hit in the back, and the bullet went through his lungs. Washington helped load the general into a wagon, but with no leader, the rest of the army began a complete and disorganized retreat. Washington and a few others were able to get the wounded Braddock to the east bank of the Monongahela River. It was a complete defeat. Never had a British army suffered such a horrible disaster on American soil. Braddock, drifting in and out of a coma, told Washington to ride along the road from whence they came and find reinforcements to allow a retreat. Washington rode for 12 hours, passing horrid scenes of dead and dying soldiers strewn along the road, something he never would forget. He finally came to the wagon train and soldiers who Braddock had split from the main body in order to move quicker. There he reported the news, and the orders from Braddock then collapsed, sleeping for 24 hours, trying to regain strength that his illness and the fatigue of fighting had caused. The next day, Washington went back to the headquarters, and a few days later, Braddock died. He and some of the other officers buried the general on the road which he had blazed. Braddock's army moved back toward Philadelphia, with the militia units going to their respective colonies. Washington returned to Mount Vernon in a depressed state. His time in the military again resulted in disaster. However, the young man will be rejoiced upon his arrival when he found a letter from Sally Fairfax. She was happy that he was unhurt from the expedition, and invited him to her home if he felt up to it. If not, she said she and some other ladies would come visit him. The next day, Washington bought some watermelons and sped off to the Belvoir mansion of Sally Fairfax. There they would spend some quality time together. Another moment upon Washington's return that brightened his day was that the governor of Virginia was restructuring the Virginia military again. This time, going back to the old way of doing things. Washington's heroic exploits at Braddock's defeat had found their way to Williamsburg, and Virginia wanted him to command their troops. However, before Washington accepted such a responsibility, he had some demands. 1. He wanted to be a part of the selection of all officers. A commander was only as good as his subordinates. 2. He wanted more aids to be provided by the colony. Thirdly, he wanted more military funding for him to conduct the military operations for Virginia. When Washington went to Williamsburg, he found that the governor had appointed 12 of the 16 captains. Therefore, Washington's demands were not met, and he declined the offer. The next several days saw the governor and Washington compromising. Washington would indeed command. However, the only officers he would select would be his lieutenant colonel and his major. During a 3-week whirlwind tour of Virginia's military installations, Washington set up his headquarters at Winchester so that he could be close to the Ohio River Valley frontier. Native American raids plagued the northern Shenandoah, and Washington didn't have the supplies nor men to combat the raids. On occasion, Washington, at the head of Virginia troops, would confiscate civilian property with a guarantee that the civilians would be reimbursed in the future. When Washington visited Fort Cumberland on the frontier, he discovered 50 Marylanders under the command of Captain John Dagworthy, who had previously held a British military commission. On the frontier, who was in command, Washington or Dagworthy? Washington went to Williamsburg to sort out the hierarchy. Dinwiddie wrote to Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, the acting commander-in-chief of all British forces in America, asking him to resolve the issue and asking him to give Washington a brevet commission in the British Army. Shirley advised Governor Sharp of Maryland to handle the issue. Sharp said that Dagworthy held no authority over Virginians, so Washington was still in command of his own troops. However, that information wasn't conveyed to Washington or Dinwiddie. Washington, flustered at the whole situation, traveled to Boston to speak with Shirley. The journey took 4 weeks through the winter months of early 1756. After a cordial meeting with Shirley, the commander-in-chief told the young Virginian that he would have an answer within a week. After 5 days, he summoned Washington and told him that he couldn't give him a royal commission. However, he gave Washington a document stating that Dagworthy held no authority over Washington, and as long as Dagworthy was at Fort Cumberland, Dagworthy must answer to Washington. Washington had gotten bad and good news from his meeting with Shirley, but the last piece of news was also depressing. Shirley informed him that word from London just appointed Governor Sharp of Maryland as the commander of all forces raised by Maryland, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. Washington had made the long journey and politic with Shirley, only to find out that Shirley was no longer his overall commander. When Washington returned to the frontier, he found that the troops were still unprepared for a campaign. Worse yet, the spring brought with it a rise in Native American attacks along the frontier. He estimated that he needed around 2,000 men to adequately patrol the frontier. He had less than a quarter of that number. He pleaded with Dinwiddie to call up the militia throughout the colony. 1,000 men showed up in various states of preparedness. Most were of no use to Washington, and he sent most of them away, declaring them marginal soldiers at best. Those 1,000 were considerably less than what the governor had called for as well. Washington suggested conscription to fill the ranks, but by summer only 254 draftees were required. Under Virginia law, conscripts could avoid service by paying a nominal fee. Many did that rather than serve. Most of his servicemen were volunteers or militiamen, and he set about draconian laws and punishments to turn them into proper soldiers. He instituted floggings, up to 500 lashes. The crimes could be anything from gambling to dereliction of duty. He hanged 2 men who were habitual deserters. Along with training troops, Washington pleaded with the politicians of Virginia to send more troops and supplies, even suggesting funding for installations to be built every 15 to 18 miles, garrisoned by 100 troops. The politicians denied most of Washington's requests or limited their scope. What resulted was Virginia's frontier getting pushed back to the Blue Ridge. Washington reported that the Shenandoah Valley was lost to Native Americans, many of them French allies. Washington lost about a third of his troops during these attacks that resulted in about 20 engagements. Rumors began to swirl, and more than a kernel of truth validated their claims that Washington was inadequate as a commander. Even a newspaper article critiqued the young officer for not spending much time on the frontier, and when he did, he lived separate from his troops and indulged in fencing lessons and other indulgent acts. It was true, Washington hadn't spent much time on the frontier, at least not as much as he needed to. He also did separate himself from his soldiers. When his officers were concerned about public opinion of their actions on the frontier, Washington rode to Williamsburg to talk with the governor. When he arrived, he found a letter ordering him back with his army and to move his headquarters from Winchester to the Maryland frontier at Fort Cumberland. Washington, enraged, rode for Winchester. At Fort Cumberland, Washington remained depressed, with only a new puppy to relieve his loneliness. When he heard that John Campbell, the Earl of Loudoun, the newest British commander-in-chief, had arrived in America, he sent him a groveling letter blaming everyone but himself for what happened on the frontier, and insisted that if Braddock had lived, he would have a royal commission. The reason he wanted the commission wasn't only because he would hold rank over colonial officers, but it would come with a pay increase and a pension when he left the army. In February 1757, he traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to meet with Campbell, who had called together the governors of the colonies for a meeting. When Washington arrived, Campbell wouldn't see him. For nearly a month, Washington occupied his time with visits to taverns and other activities in the city, until finally Campbell agreed to meet him. When the two met, the 52-year-old Loudoun, who was well-educated and an experienced soldier, wouldn't allow Washington to speak. The commander-in-chief gave the young provincial officer orders asking him 2 or 3 questions, then turned his back, signaling the meeting was over. The only thing that Washington liked about the meeting was that he was ordered back to Winchester. Dejected by his experience with John Campbell, Washington returned to his command.